Our last speaker today is Professor Jorge Hidalgo. He's currently a professor of critical care medicine, Secretary General of the World Federation of the Intensive Care Medicine. He's the head of intensive care unit and the COVID-19 unit, Belize Healthcare Partner, Belize Corporation. He's a member of the Society of Critical Care Medicine and Fundamental Critical Care Obstetrics. He's an author of many chapters of critical care obstetrics and an editor of Obstetric Catastrophes, among other books. Prof. Hidalgo is going to talk to us today about the pathophysiology of sepsis. Prof. Hidalgo, the microphone is yours. If you may start.
Well, thank you again for having me. It's
Thank you
a
very
real
much.
pleasure. And of course, talking about one of the things I think so as a intensivist, we love the most, um, despite that we know that it's a significant advances in the understanding and hemodynamic monitoring and resuscitation measure, but sepsis, despite of everything, remain a major cause of morbidity and mortality in our ICUs. In that I'm Dr. Jorge Hidalgo, and as I've been introduced, I work at the head of the ICU unit at Belize Healthcare Partners and at the COVID-19 unit at Belize Healthcare Partners. And it's a real pleasure to meet with you, to be with you today. I mean that we are going to trying to go through in the next half an hour with some of the most current information about sepsis pathophysiology. And as I told you already, there are many things that we still not understand. However, where we are right now, we will share some important points. There are no conflicts of interest with this presentation. And then, as we know, sepsis is definitely one of the most common deadly disease. And even that we already mentioned, it's been a lot and remarkable progress in the understanding of the condition. Is still continue a very complex syndrome, and for both we as a clinician at the bedside of the patient and the scientists at the bench, many key questions still unanswered in the pathophysiology way. I mean, sepsis is essential, as we know, described as a syndrome consisting of a complex pathophysiological biochemical dysregulation, and is essentially triggered could be by bacterial, viral, parasitics of even a fungal infections. And many things has been essentially done on trying to understand the concepts of sepsis, and there are many efforts to trying to define, and as we usually say, each definition by definition we need to review it regularly to see based on the evidence what things need to be changed. And as now sepsis is officially defined as a dysregulated host response to an infection that causes a life-threatening organ dysfunction. And the nature of sepsis is extremely complex, and the disease course can differ markedly between patients, and yet sepsis cannot be determined with certainty in many cases. And of course, it's a huge effort into trying to define sepsis and also involving all the different elements. And as we know, even before the 4th century, Hippocrates been proposed several terms with the intention to understand sepsis regarding at that point as a process of decay or decomposition of organic matter that we say putrefaction. Some other say that it's a blood poisoning. Systemic inflammatory response syndrome was one of the first definitions in 1992. And in 2003, we have and syndrome of an infection complicated that can lead to organ dysfunction until we now have the section sepsis definition 3, who essentially says that sepsis is a life-threatening organ dysfunction that is caused by a dysregulated host response to infection. I mean, the path of sepsis, as we know, is nothing new. However, in the last decade, in the last probably since 2000, it's been a lot of efforts to trying to understand and to trying to have a better understanding, not only about the pathophysiology, but also trying to increase our armamentarium and our different therapeutic options to deal with a very complex disease. And despite of that, despite of all those efforts, decades of research, up to now, we don't have any specific therapies for sepsis, and basically the current management relies on a source control, antibiotics decision, and organ support. I mean that sepsis 3 that was essentially presented in 2016 still today what we know that is a essentially life-threatening organ dysfunction caused by a dysregulated host response to infection. And we define septic shock as a subset of sepsis with circulatory and cellular metabolic dysfunction associated with a higher risk of mortality. I mean that is where we are now. However, as I always see, something is constant in medicine is the change. I mean that this is our definition, but probably in a couple of years, with based on the information we are gathering and also the research, we will probably have another definition. I mean, and in sepsis, the normal careful inflammatory balance is disturbed, and is essentially not only a process of systemic inflammatory response of our immune disorder, but essentially will involve changes in the function of multiple organs in the body, even at the level of cellular and also at molecular levels. And we know that this is an hyperinflammation that together with immune suppression process, and it basically leads to a very dysregulated immune response to infection, and is associated with failure to return to the normal homeostasis. No? And then we will see essentially an imbalance in inflammatory response, immune dysfunction, mitochondrial damage, coagulopathy, neuroendocrine network abnormalities, endoplasmic reticulum stress, autophagy, and other pathophysiological process that essentially will ultimately lead to multi-organ dysfunction, and is well characterized in this cartoon, trying to summarize what we mentioned regarding the different aspects that involves sepsis, no, being a neuroendocrine network with all the different players involved that we are going to talk about with more detail as we progress in the lecture. Now, the first step in the initiation of the host response to the pathogen is the activation of an innate immune cells. And essentially, that's basically is constituted by macrophage, monocytes, neutrophils, the natural killer cells. And this occurs essentially by binding of the different stimulation of the pattern, the pathogen associated molecular patterns, the alarmins, the peripheral receptors. And essentially, those are going to lead to activation of a target genes coding for the pro-inflammatory cytokines, such as necrosis, tumor necrosis factors, and some of the interleukins. And cytokines are important, and we know that those are Basically, by definition, cytokines are small proteins that can regulate the host response both at local and systemically, and is basically released by various cells, type of cells, such as the monocytes and the neutrophils. Mean that that is a very interesting concept, because when we have a successful pathogen, those essentially must be attached and cross the mucosal barrier with the intention to escape the host defense system and also multiply to ensure its own survival. All invading microorganisms which have sufficient load and virulence can cause sepsis. However, as we can see, there are several pathogens that are well known for their impressive arsenal to attack the host. And probably with that, one of the most common that we know and we are living right now, and we're facing right now, is SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, where we essentially are trying to understand his capacity to essentially attack and make us very sick. I mean, the inflammatory imbalance definitely will represent the most critical basis of sepsis pathogenesis and occur through a whole process of sepsis. And the pathogens basically are going to elicit all this response, including organisms through the whole process of sepsis, and the pathogens eliciting the response, including all these or the different organisms. And we know that the most important thing is that we as a host, we can recognize the molecular components of the invading pathogens, call it the pathogen-associated molecular patterns with the specific receptors. We also have a limit of number specialized host receptors known as a pattern recognition receptors. That mediated recognition and is important for the mechanism of defense against the invading pathogens, and results in an upregulation of the inflammatory genes, transcription, and initiation of the innate immunity. A contributing factor also of the PPRs can also be stimulated by endogenous moleculars, and it is so-called the danger-associated molecular patterns, or in more simple terms, also we know these receptors as an alarmins. I mean, those are important concepts in the host recognition of pathogens at a starting point. I mean that one of the interesting things that we see is the inflammatory response to the viral infections. And we know that we can have at the beginning, or what we normally see is a protected and regulated inflammation, where essentially we see that despite of the viral agents is attacking our body, in a protective regulation in inflammation, the virus are unable to create a robust inflammation response, because we have an early interferon response. And essentially that means that we have a control or regulated inflammation with inflammatory monocytes, macrophage, and neutrophil infiltration, and pro-inflammatory cytokines, but in a very stratified, a controlled way. That means that we have a minimal epithelial and endothelial cell apoptosis, and reduced vascular leakage, optimal T cells and antibody response, and effective virus clearance. Essentially, we call it a protective immunity and host survival. In the other hand, we have a pathogenic and dysregulated inflammation, essentially where we have the virus that basically create a robust inflammation response. We have a delay interferon response, and then we have an incredible amount of inflammatory monocytes, macrophage, and neutrophil inflammation not regulated, an incredible amount of pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines. And then as a consequence of that, we will have an enhanced epithelial and endothelial cell apoptosis, increase on vascular leakage, and a very suboptimal response of T cells and antibodies, and an impaired virus clearance that it will lead to an acute lung injury. It will lead to an acute respiratory distress syndrome, and we are not able to control that. It will progress to multi-organ failures and death. I mean that is essentially where we are, and we know that all these processes, it will start and it will create an important aspect at the level of the microcirculation. I mean that that is one of the most important things that we will discuss in these slides, where essentially we will see all the different mechanisms that is essentially leading to microcirculatory dysfunction, and essentially that we will try to understand. And as we know, at the level of endothelial basis, we have the mechanism to lead into microcirculatory dysfunction. We have for right here the alarmins, or the damage and pathogen associated molecular patterns, and also we have the oxidative stress and alter nitric oxide production that will contribute to endothelial dysfunction. And as a result of that, what we will see is that an important component, who is the glycocalyx, where we will have a denudation, and essentially it will alter the colloid osmotic gradient between the capillary lumen and also protein-rich areas that are protected by the glycocalyx bilayer, leading to an increase of the capillary leak, and increase of addition of platelets and neutrophils. And also we will see an important alter on the microvascular flow, an activation of the coagulation cascade, and all these different damage at the level of the micro circulation, with alter endothelial cell-to-cell communication. I mean that that is a very important for us to understand. No? And of course, we know that all these mechanisms are basically revolve around the loss of the auto-regulation secondary to endothelial cell injury, and alter retrograde endothelial cell-to-cell communication, and impair red blood cell deformability, and increase on blood viscosity. And we know that all these processes will basically favor the presence of alteration in the coagulation system. The glycocalyx, as we know, have an important biochemical activities, including the maintenance of the blood flow and protection of the barrier function. And then we see platelet activation, leukocyte adhesion and rolling, and activation of the coagulation and the complement systems. I mean that that is an important, because as we know, the complement have an important role and collaboration, and the complement basically will attack dangerous cells, pathogens, phagocyte cells that can respond more properly to the activation. And in sepsis, this teamwork is altered. And we know that in the complement, probably one of the most harmful is the role of the C5a in sepsis, that essentially is being linked to neutrophil dysfunction, apoptosis, lymphoid cells, exacerbation of systemic inflammation. It will cause cardiomyopathy, disseminate intravascular coagulation, and it's in several experimental sepsis studies that highlighting the benefits to trying to blockage the C5a signaling and outcomes. And now is one of in the future, C5a is considered as a potential therapeutic target for sepsis. Meaning that the activation of the essentially leads to upregulation of the inflammatory mediator that essentially will result in systemic inflammation response that includes an activation of the coagulation system and current down-regulation of the anticoagulants mechanisms. And as we know, the coagulation abnormalities, it basically can range from a mild to a very relevant clinical fulminant coagulopathies, where probably one of the most common is a DIC, and is the most severe manifestation of this disrupted of the hemostasis with microvascular thrombosis and consumption of clotting factors and platelets and simultaneous hemorrhage. And in the coagulation system and vascular endothelium, probably the most important initiation factor of coagulation in sepsis is the tissue factor, no? That essentially indeed inhibits the tissue factors, prevent DIC, and improve survival in experimental sepsis. No, I mean that basically the tissue factors is predominantly produced by macrophages and monocytes, exemplifying the close interaction with inflammation and coagulation. And also the tissue factor can reside in microparticles that are formed by hematopoietic and endothelial cells. And these microparticles play a significant role in both coagulation and inflammation. I mean, that essentially is trying to summarize what we've been discussing. Just because of time, we will trying to progress. This is the one of the most probably component that we are seeing right now, especially in COVID-19, with the thromboinflammatory cascade being activated and the possibility to see too many clotting problems in COVID-19. I mean, the other important components are the activation of the coagulation system and vascular injury that are essentially amplified by the releasing of the neutrophil extracellular traps, or that we call it nets, that are essentially composed by DNA, histones, and neutrophil derived proteinasas, and can protect the hosting by eliminating pathogens. The nets also may also contribute to collateral damage and thrombosis, either dysregulating the immune system response. This one, of course, is the trying to understand what are the consequences of the alter of the microvascular flow. And then we know that in normal vascular microcirculatory flow, the cells extract oxygen to meet the oxygen consumption requirements. In an homogeneously decreased flow, results in a decreased oxygen delivery, but it will preserve the extraction of the oxygen consumption with a resulting decrease in venous oxygen saturation. However, in homogeneously decreased flow results in decreased oxygen delivery, it will preserve with the oxygen, but it will cause an important decrease in venous oxygen saturation. However, what is important, what is going to happen in an heterogeneous flow? In heterogeneous flow, we'll see that despite of the preservation of total oxygen delivery, only a portion of the capillaries are going to be perfused. These cells are essentially too distant from to be perfused, and they are not receiving enough oxygen to meet the metabolic requirements and became hypoxic. And definitely that is going to have some translation in what we are seeing in our patients. I mean, that one of the most important concepts also is the metabolic reprogramming as a cell survival strategy. And we know that essentially what we see is that the cellular metabolic downregulation is observed in early sepsis as a proposed of adaptive mechanism with the intention to do a reprioritization in energy consumption to limit the additional injury, and trying to maintain an energy balance, preventing DNA damage, and preserve a cellular consumption. I mean that is probably this is exemplifies this one, where essentially we see that we are trying to in the common epithelial cells, especially at the level of the lungs, we see that the bacterial transport in the lungs become altered in sepsis, causing loss of the polarity. You know, we see this is in a normal circumstances, but in sepsis, is a alteration of the bacterial transport with loss of polarity, and it will translate clinically with loss of polarity and injury, loss of alveolar fluid, reabsorption, pulmonary edema, loss of barrier function, and some of the biomarkers that are involved. At the epithelial barrier function in the intestines becomes altered in sepsis, causing an increasing of the bacterial translocation. We see a loss of the tight junctions, the signaling is altered, and then it will translate clinically to increase in the mucosal permeability, translocation of bacteria, some of the pumps, an increase of the apoptosis, and some of the biomarkers that are involved. And finally, and a very sensitive organs as the kidneys also lost his communication and signaling, and that became associated with the alteration in the cell and paracrine and endocrine communication, and it will translate in loss of polarity, decrease in tubular ion reabsorption, and also we ended for us clinically translations in patients with basically progress to acute kidney injury and acute kidney failure. And the other concepts are the cellular regulation of mitochondria, mitophagy, and biogenesis. And as we know in this slide, we see that the preferential oxidation of the glucose through glycolysis, despite of the availability of oxygen, that is important, aerobic glycolysis is a phenomenon that we know as a Warburg effect. And this Warburg effect is particularly interesting because most of the time we see that in patients with cancer, but we are seeing this concept more applied into sepsis. No? Using this mechanism, the immune cells basically will cause a reprogrammation of the pathways of energy generation, such that the housekeeping functions are essentially sustained by the exchange of phosphoryl oxidation through anaerobic glycolysis. Mean that and all these things essentially what is going to cause is and basically changes of the behavior of the mitochondria to trying to preserve energy. We will have this concept of mitophagy and biogenesis, where essentially with the intention of preserve the cells acting as, that we call it as a checkpoint. What we do that is in this, the cells decides if he is going to progress to the next step in the division, and if they know that is these steps, it will compromise the energy, they will stop. And then after that, they will also using the mechanisms of the phenomenon of Warburg that is going to be revolving glycolysis and the phosphorylation, oxidative phosphorylation, and also we call sickle cell arrest as a preserving energy mechanisms, and of course that it has these three phenomena right here as an adaptive metabolic reprogram. We will see the translation into damage into the endothelial cell and the microcirculation causing that we call it a microvascular dysfunction. I mean, that is essentially to summarize that we already discussed, where the pumps and dams, it will alter and it will initiate immune response. will create an overwhelming release of inflammatory mediators. And if we are unable to control this process, it will cause a dysregulation of the immune hemostasis, causing organ injury and also impair in the clearance of the pathogens. And finally, the growing body evidence demonstrates that the gut microbiota interacts with the gut epithelium in the host immune system, and the microbiome and its metabolites are essentially regulators of health under steady and state regulation. A severe insults, essentially as a trauma or infection, what we cause is a profound changes in the intestinal ecosystem that we call it dysbiosis, and leading to loss of the diversity of the physiological and most anaerobic flora, the unification of the microbiome composition at different sites, and of growth of the pathophysiological and nosocomial problems. No? Mean that sepsis affects the composition of the intestinal microbiome, and it will be characterized by loss of diversity, lower abundance of key commensals, and essentially it will cause something that we call it as an emergency term, the pathobiome, where essentially changes are critical and to trying to restore this functionality. The immune response can further be compromised when translocation of pathological microbes through the disintegrated epithelial barrier results in systemic and lymphatic spread of pathogens. Mean that in conclusion for this presentation today, sepsis is defined as a life-threatening organ dysfunction caused by a dysregulated host response to infection characterized by a sustained hyperinflammation and immune suppression. And while much progress has been made in understanding the pathogenesis of sepsis, the translation of this knowledge into effective novel sepsis therapies has been unsuccessful. And then the aim of future of sepsis research is just there, trying to understand and trying to develop new options, therapeutic options for our patients. Thank you. You also can join World Sepsis Meeting, and then you will have access to most relevant information of sepsis. And also you are invited to the World Congress of Critical Care and Intensive Care in September 11 and 15. That is going to be also fully virtual. Thank you for the invitation. And I don't know if you have any comments or any questions.
Thank you very much, Prof. Hidalgo. I have a small question. Do we have any better understanding of what happens in the COVID-19 in comparison to the pathophysiology, the inflammatory response of the body?
Yeah, well, you know, as we are in this, all of us together, despite of the understanding in the pathophysiology of the COVID-19, this as we know is an RNA virus, that only to know that the size of the virus, if we conceptualize an RNA as normal, the RNA usually the size is 11 kilobases, and we have the coronavirus, who essentially has a size of 25 to up to 31 kilobases. Then just by definition, we say we have a virus that is going to have an incredible amount of mutation, and it will cause for him to commit suicide and not survive. But this, as also we are knowing in the understanding of the coronavirus, the virus also have certain strong abilities to have a control mutations, and that we are seeing right now. We are facing with different mutations that we were expecting, but of course, the fact that we are not, or the public is not follow the different directions, then we are facing with those different that we're faced with the possibility to have more mutation, and also trying to have a more aggressive virus. I mean that our understanding is still, even that we know more, but the knowledge and the understanding of the virus is also, we still every day surprising and knowing a little bit more.
Thank you very much, Prof. Hidalgo, for this illustration. And thank you all the speakers. It's Sunday today, and I think it's very early at your side, Prof. Hidalgo and Dr. Colburn. And we appreciate that you're waking up early to give us a lecture at this time. And thank you very much, Dr. Migari, as well, from Greece. Would like to visit your country soon. And thank you, everyone, on the moderator side. Dr. Mahdi, thank you very much.